Welcome everybody to Psych 3600 Abnormal Psychology. I'm Professor Tsushima, and why don't we start with the first of our lectures, our YouTube lectures on Psych 3600. Okay, so let me pull up my screen here. And yep, here we go. Alrighty, folks. Chapter 1 on abnormal psychology. Okay, so today what we will be doing is we will be defining what abnormal behavior is. And first of all, like many definitions in life and certainly psychological ones, not as simple as we may think at first consideration. Yeah, so we'll give a deeper consideration and see just the how complex it is to define abnormal behavior in general, but also to see what counts as abnormal behavior, how that's very much a complex question. Okay, we'll probably skip the historical perspectives on abnormal psych. Then we'll be spending a big part of our discussion on research methods, okay, and designs, which will be important to be familiar with and mindful of as we're going through the different types of abnormal behavior and diagnoses, because we're going to invariably be discussing numerous studies which support findings regarding the different types of abnormal behavior, as well as treatments for those conditions. Yeah, so a lot of this class, the greater focus will be on the diagnoses, understanding the particular diagnoses, what characterize them, what are some of the causes of different diagnoses. But there will also be a significant chunk of time spent on treatments. Yeah, and the different types of, because there are different treatments are relevant for different problems. Okay, it isn't one type of treatment for all conditions. All righty. So moving right along, um, defining abnormal behavior. Okay, so abnormal psychology, the study of abnormal psychology, there are various journals of abnormal psychology. Some people, that's their area of expertise in terms of research and so on. And obviously we have graduate and undergraduate coursework like our class on abnormal psychology. It is the branch of psychology that studies abnormal behavior as well as the treatment of abnormal behavior. But you may be asking, what is abnormal behavior? All right, we'll get to that in just a moment. Okay. Also wanted to kind of delineate what is meant by a disorder. Okay, so when you hear the term psychological disorder or mental disorder, yeah, it's usually in reference to a specific diagnosis. All righty, so mental disorder, let's say a mental disorder would be major depression, yeah, or bipolar disorder, or panic disorder, okay, which is characterized by suffering a series of panic attacks. Okay, so a psychological disorder, mental disorder, is a very circumscribed condition, okay, diagnosis and so on, which need to, and for someone to be diagnosed as suffering from a psychological or mental disorder, they need to demonstrate certain characteristics or symptoms. Yeah. And very typically, you need to demonstrate these symptoms for a certain period of time so that it's demonstrating a pattern of behavior. You know, we're not talking about an instance where someone takes a substance and has a weird reaction for a few hours, and then that's it, right? Their behavior may be peculiar or abnormal, but that doesn't mean they're suffering from a mental disorder. Okay. Now, if they do that, every few days and it's interfering with work and they're socialized, then they're probably suffering from some kind of substance abuse disorder. All righty. So keep in mind a certain number of characteristics have to be met or symptoms, and then for a period of time. Yeah. So what is normal? Well, this is what we'll discuss in when we get a chance to meet face to face or online. Yeah, through Zoom is a bit of a discussion of what is normal, but we'll just kind of jump right to some of the considerations of what is considered normal or abnormal. Now, some criteria that go to what we consider abnormality, yeah, include these six characteristics, more or less, right? Some lists will be shorter, some will be a bit longer. Okay. Now, clearly, the first thing that comes to mind, I have a picture of a character from Mel Brooks' Young Frankenstein. This character was not Igor, but Igor. I'll leave it to you as to why he was called Igor. Um, but one of the things that certainly may go to what we consider abnormal behavior, yeah, is how unusual the behavior is. All right, so if it's kind of bizarre, very unique, very rare, right? It's not usual, but it's unusual in terms of frequency. That may, be one of the considerations, right? But as you're thinking about it, you might see how that's kind of tricky, right? Just relying on how unusual or atypical or statistically, rare or something is. Yeah. Um, because there are a lot of good things, healthy things, right? Or creative, novel things, which are rare, but doesn't mean that they're abnormal, right? It may be a demonstration of a particular talent or skill or great idea or thinking style or problem solving style. Yeah. And that's why our species thrives on diversity. Yeah. And unique ideas and unique individuals. Um, if everyone was absolutely the same, we probably wouldn't survive much longer. All right, because the environment always throws something new at us, right? So we thrive on our diversity and our uniqueness. So this, although may be considered, factored in, yeah, um, we want to kind of pause on how much reliance we may place on this one factor. Okay. Related to it is social deviance. Yeah, it's kind of pretty similar to unusual, but bizarre. Unusualness captures like how bizarre it is, how unique. Social deviance is how much it deviates, like statistically, from the norm. Yeah, it's similar, but you can look at it as okay. Well, what's the average way of speaking or volume of speaking? And is someone speaking too loud or too soft? Right. And again, even with deviance, right? I mean, someone can like and you're saying what? And then someone could be screaming at the top of their lungs, in church and then or temple, and then you're going, "Hey, shut up! Lower your voice. What are you out of your mind?" Um, but yeah, isn't it tricky though? Yeah, at what point do you cut the what's the bright line test for when you're talking too soft or too loud? Yeah, or too far, too close. I mean, clearly at some point, based on social standards, you do cross the line, so to speak, with speaking too soft or too loud or too closely or too far. Yeah, but you can see these are very relative. Yeah, it's not like there's a quick bright line test. It's not like a ruler and you can measure the difference between someone who's 5'7" and 5'8", right? And you know what an inch is. Yeah. Um, so there is a bright line for that physical index. But for behavioral index, right? At what point is it deviant, right? Maybe statistically, we can mathematically determine voice value, what's the average, and what's one standard deviation is two standard deviations away. Yeah. But then what standard deviation do you count, right? Do you count one standard deviation or two standard deviations or 1.5? At what point do you count? In other words, so you may say, well, one standard deviation, right? That would tell you statistically whether there's a significant difference. However, if you're comparing means, right, how much one deviates from the mean, not means, but how much one deviates from the mean. But then, maybe that's just a louder person. You wouldn't say that's abnormal, or he's quieter. Yeah, but you don't think, well, he suffers from, he's demonstrating abnormal behavior. He's just a quiet guy. Okay. And and things may vary as a function of culture, right? Whether you and we can think of national culture, ethnic racial culture. There's even generational culture. Yeah, what those from let's see, the baby boom generation, Generation X, which I'm a member of, millennials, Generation Z. Each of those generational groups have certain standards or in terms of what's considered deviant behavior, like just for example, just for internet behavior, yeah, or email texting behavior. There are cultural differences between those generations. Now, certainly faulty perceptions or reality testing is a interesting factor to consider as well. If someone, faulty perceptions, we think about how someone thinks about things. Yeah, how do they put together information? Yeah, but that can be tricky, right? Especially with politics. At what point is someone's political view, right, just very far left or far right, or to what extent is it becoming like delusional, right? Or they're subscribing to a whole bunch of conspiracy theories that have no factual basis. Yeah, well, at least factual basis in terms of what objectively we can determine, or what majority of people determine. Um, but see, even that's tricky too, right? What's the rule? Is it the majority rule? Maybe the majority is wrong. We know in science the majority's been wrong, right? There's a time not too far back in the distant past where people thought the world was flat, and that was the majority, and only a minority thought otherwise. Yeah, there's still too many people who think that the world now, who still believe that the world is a flat. But be that as it may, right? Well, yeah, take that for example. To what extent is that abnormal? Abnormal behavior or psychological disorder? Okay. Um, so how they perceive, how they make sense of the world, and also reality testing. Yeah. And when you talk about reality testing, yeah, you're talking about one sense, similarly how one makes sense of the world, but it can also include things such as visual, auditory sensations. Yeah. Do they see things, hear things? Yeah. Um, so another factor to take into account is distress. Yeah. And this is maybe one that most of us feel kind of comfortable with. Okay. Now, distress, in many instances, when it comes to psychological disorders, really goes down to the individual subjective distress, yeah, versus the distress that they may cause in family or in their marriage, or problems at work. But a lot of these things are easier to kind of measure, right? If you're having problems at work, right, you're not getting promoted, no one's giving you good assignments, or lo and behold, they're thinking of firing you, right? And social, right? If you're dating, you're having problems with dating, or friends, you're losing friends. Those are objective and clearer to identify. But also with distress, right? If you consider family distress, or group distress, or the individual's distress, yeah, if someone's telling you, I'm really sad, I don't think I can take it any longer. We want to take that into account. Okay. And then maybe we feel better about conceptualizing that as a mental disorder worthy of treatment, worthy of help, right? Because that's pain, right? Instead of someone saying, oh, my back hurts, they're saying their heart hurts, right? And they can't take it anymore. And that's something you want to, you hear words like that, you want to take that really seriously. All righty. You also want to consider how maladaptive the behaviors you're observing are. Yeah. And here again, you want to take into account work, social situations. So, is what they're doing, the behavior that seems kind of novel or odd, does it help them make friends, date, get along with the family, do well at work, or is it hurting those things? Okay. And finally, dangerousness is another one. Maybe that's a criterion that's a little easier to kind of think about in terms of what we'll consider mental disorder. Are they causing any danger to themselves and or others? Alrighty, but even then, that can be tricky too. Yeah, what violent behaviors do you count? Now, clearly, if someone wants to kill somebody or kill themselves, I mean, alrighty, I don't think there's too much debate as to whether that's dangerous. Yeah, but what if someone starts yelling more at people? You know, um, and so on. Is that dangerous? It's certainly not pro-social, right? It's certainly problematic. But if someone is very argumentative, right? Is that something that you would factor in when considering them as suffering from a mental disorder? Maybe so, maybe not, right? Maybe so if you think it's narcissism and they're constantly arguing with people because they're super sensitive, they're super thin skinned, and if you say anything that sounds like you're differing with them, they experience it as a personal attack. And someone suffering from narcissistic personality disorder will probably demonstrate being very argumentative frequently. Yeah. But what if being argumentative is something that gets them money, right? They're a television celebrity and they make a lot of money that way. So it's certainly helping them in terms of the occupation. Yeah. They're getting money from it. And also the question kind of comes, well, is the behavior driven by the environment, right? Behaviorally, they're getting reinforced for this behavior, or is it arising from them? Yeah. I think in the latter, we see that more as a mental disorder, right? That you have this personality character, whatever that is, that's inclined to argue intensely and frequently with people, versus if it's coming from the outside and you are clearly getting paid to do this, and because you get paid so much money, it becomes something of a practice behavior for you. Yeah, so is that a mental disorder, or just a lousy kind of situation as a function of television celebrity and money? Alrighty, I leave that to you. But I think what our discussion kind of illustrates is that there are a number of things to factor in, but it's not a simple roll in, roll out, right? So certainly, just as individuals, we need to think about this, but certainly, as psychologists, we need to think about, and certainly as clinical psychologists, right, we got to consider all these factors and how to think about each factor. It's not just, oh, yes or no, right? It's not a simple checklist. It's about thinking critically about the words and what they mean, and then applying them and understanding all the circumstances, which may argue one way or the other. Okay, very good. Okay, we'll skip the survey. We'll skip historical perspectives, research methods. Okay, in starting our discussion about research, now a lot of this is going to come across as kind of review from many of you if you took a research method, which I think you did as a prerequisite, or stats, or even Psych 1000. But it's important, I think, for us to get back. Well, it's just an important thing in psychology, right? But certainly when thinking about abnormal behavior. Um, so first of all, what is the scientific attitude? Yeah, and the scientific attitude can be characterized as an attitude where you frequently raise these two questions. Yeah, when someone makes an assertion, yeah, let's just say they assert that lesbians are more depressed than heterosexual women. Okay, well, you want to ask the question. Well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by depression? Yeah, what do you mean by lesbian? Yeah, I mean, we all, I think, generally know that that refers to female homosexuality. Yeah, but then that kind of leads to the next question. How do you know that? Right? What are you basing this assertion that lesbian women um, are more depressed than heterosexual women? Yeah. Now, there are some studies that actually do support that. Yeah. They tend to be survey studies and so on. But you want to ask yourselves, how did they know that? What was the nature of the study? What was the nature of the survey? Was it just self report? Right? Because if it's just self-report, right, well, that's certainly kind of concerning if more lesbians, say on a Likert scale of 1 to 7 that there are 7 on depression, and and heterosexual women tend to say they're more like a 5 or 4. Yeah, that's one thing. But maybe it's another thing if you find out the study had psychiatrists or psychologists do diagnostic interviews with 80 lesbians and then 80 heterosexual women. And maybe that would be different. Maybe your findings would be different. Why? Oh, that's something to think about. Yeah. So whenever you hear any kind of assertion in psychology about human behavior, those are the two main questions you want to always think about. Yeah. And that's part of being skeptical. Okay. Not cynical, meaning that, you give up and you just have a pessimistic, negative attitude about things, but that you have a questioning attitude. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's quite healthy. Yeah. The other, just being accepting, I don't know what the opposite of skepticism is, I guess, passivism or passivity. Not so great. Okay. Now, here, what's also clearly kind of invoked is the nature of critical thinking. And we talk about that all the time, but it's good to kind of revisit that, know what we need to do. Yeah, it's kind of like good meditation. You don't just think about it once. You want to periodically do some reading on meditation. Same thing with critical thinking. What is critical thinking? Yeah, well, critical thinking, right, when presented with data, assertions, findings, um, usually involves these kinds of behaviors. Yeah, an examination of the underlying assumptions with a certain assertion. Go back to lesbians versus heterosexual women. What values maybe underlying the particular investigation at hand. Yeah. Now, psychology as a science of human behavior, yeah, values certain things, but it values the scientific method, objectivity, uh, um, specificity of what you're counting, things like that. Yeah. You want to, though, always think, are there other underlying values that may be permeating or affecting the findings of a particular researcher? Yeah, like values about family over, maybe the traditional mother, father, male, female, um, parental family as opposed to same-sex family. Is there something about the research or the way it's designed that seems to imply an assumption that male female parental team or duo is the norm? All righty. And as we know, when it comes to family structures at this point, um, there are so many different family designs and structures. What is the evidence? Yeah. So is it survey? Is it information gathered by clinicians through diagnostic structured interviews? Are they an experiment, right? Did they randomly assign people to different conditions and so on? Yeah. And finally, the conclusion. So you got the data, yeah, but data doesn't necessarily equal conclusions. Yeah. It should be as conclusions about data. It should be as close to the data as possible. Yeah. This is where the old expression inferential leap comes in. Yeah, you don't want a conclusion about findings being a huge inferential leap from what was found. Yeah, so just because in a on the street survey with lesbians versus heterosexual women, more lesbians, on one Likert scale reported level of depression that's more of a 6, whereas on average, right, heterosexual women, let's say for example, scored 5, and the mean of 5 versus the mean of 6 was a statistically significant difference given the number of subjects in the sample. Okay, can you then conclude that more lesbians suffer from clinical depression than heterosexual women? Probably not. Not just on a one on the street survey based on one Likert scale. Yeah, that would be a huge inferential leap. One that would probably be closer, given that kind of design, is that if you concluded that informally lesbians report a higher level of depression than heterosexual women, and that would be true. That's exactly what the data was that you found, right? And that doesn't mean it's not nothing just because it's better that it's closer to the data, and it still tells you something that is concerning. And it may tell you, okay, well, if you want to find out about clinical depression, then you got to think about, okay, what research design will give you that kind of evidence or data so you can make that conclusion. Okay, so with that, let me pause here and we will continue uno momento. Okay, hello everybody, welcome back. Just took a little Red Bull break there, and without further ado, let's continue with our discussion. And with that, that'd be find where we were. Oh, let me pull this up. Oh, here we go. All righty, sorry about that delay. So we discussed the scientific attitude and critical thinking and the method. Yeah, the scientific method, as just generally speaking, involves utilizing a theory, right? And what is a theory? It's an integrated set of principles or framework that helps you kind of organize and explain and make predictions about some kind of observable phenomenon. Okay, so you may have a theory that increased, let's say, a theory of how increased cell phone and social media use has caused or contributed to an increase in depression, suicide, and anxiety among members in Gen Z, which, by the way, there is data to support that. Yeah, and your theory maybe it's because of particularly comparison theory, integrating comparison theory, people looking at their lives compared to others, and as well as the function of bullying, yeah, online bullying through social media. Alrighty, so that might be your theory that helps explain what's going on with Gen Z and why are they experiencing, greater levels of the problems I just described. Yeah, and what and it and part of it, not the whole story, but part of it is probably the relationship between cell phone social media use um, and its um, and its relationship with those variables. Okay, now when we come up with a theory, right? Generally, the way the scientific method occurs in most instances is someone has an observation of things that are going on. Yeah, like let's just say it seems to someone that there is an increase in the number of adolescents showing up at outpatient centers for depression and suicide as of the last several years. Right, so someone might generate the theory. Well, why would it be Gen Z? Right, they come up with a hypothesis about cell phone social media usage, and then they come up with a prediction that if that's a hypothesis, if their theory is that it has something to do with comparing oneself to others and getting bullied, right? Then your hypothesis would be, right, the more cell phone usage, yeah, that you would predict a greater level of depression, anxiety, or suicidal thoughts, yeah. And actually, those kind of correlations have been found. So it's observation, you come up with a theory. The theory leads to a specific question, hypothesis, yeah, which would allow, if confirmed, would allow for prediction. And then you collect the data, right? That's your observation. So you might do a survey with adolescents, or put an app where you can determine how much they're using their phone, right? So they don't have to tell you. You don't have to rely on subjective memory or recall of how often they use the phone. You can collect data on how often they use the phone, how often it was unlocked, and then over a period of time, and then how the degree of phone usage is correlated with depressive symptoms, and so on. Okay, and scientific method is also characterized by operational definitions. As you may recall from other classes, an operational definition is one which allows you to observe something. Okay, so an operational, you wouldn't just say, oh, it's going to increase depression, right? You want to operationalize it. So you might operationalize depression as several criteria from the diagnostic manual of mental disorders. Yeah, if they meet certain criteria, you'd say, wow, they meet clinical depression. So you want to see maybe how many of your sample prior to cell phone use and then after cell phone use meet criteria for severe depression. Alrighty, let's talk about research designs. Alrighty, we're going to be talking about three major types and a lot of the sub designs that fall under these major categories. Okay. The first are descriptive studies. Now, descriptive studies, as the term kind of connotes here, describe a phenomenon. Okay, they don't explain cause and effect. Yeah, but they provide data to kind of specifically describe what's going on from an observational framework or standpoint. Yeah, one is the case study. Yeah, so based on one or a few individual cases, right, you might be seeing a interesting phenomenon that is worthy of further research, okay, and exploration. Now, a case study, right, is some kind of unique, and this happens in the forensic field very often. Some kind of unique crime is being committed. There's a unique type of serial murder, perhaps. Yeah. Then from these one or few cases, by the way, as an aside, I don't want to stereotype the uh, area of criminal profiling, which some of the ideas in criminal profiling is based on, several numerous case studies. Okay, so I don't want to be kind of confusing one for the other. Alrighty. And by the way, criminal profiling is a whole other issue beyond the scope of our discussion on research designs. But a case study, yeah, typically you're thinking about one or a few cases. Alrighty. Like for example, a clinician might observe a unique case that he has, right, of an adolescent who's transgendered or bisexual and experiencing depression in romantic relationships. Yeah, so that clinician may observe that once the one case, or maybe she has two cases at her high school. Yeah, and then observes them along a 4-month period, measures the depression self-report measure, as well as quantifying their social interactions. You have to try to see if these one or two cases, either transgendered or bisexual, have certain, if there seems to be some kind of connection between the number of social interactions and depressive symptoms, for example. Okay. Now, the thing that's great about case studies is that they're often maybe the first signs of things that are going to be coming down the pike. Yeah. And as with coronavirus, we started off with a few cases and it exploded to a global phenomenon. Similar things can happen with psychology. Yeah. Unique cases of depression, or unique cases of eating disorders and so on might start off, because we never had that category, we didn't notice it. We might start seeing it because it's either novel or we just never looked out for certain kinds of problems. And maybe some clinician in her wisdom started, becoming more aware of a unique type of problem. And so he or she wanted to document it in a case study of one or a few cases, and that might shed light to a new phenomena. Yeah. And if it's published, then other clinicians might respond similarly. And next thing you know, we're addressing something that we've been ignoring for a period of time. Very common, another common research design that's descriptive in nature is a survey. Yeah, probably the most common type of survey is the online questionnaire, asking people about their behaviors as it relates to other behaviors and so on. So for example, I currently, with a few other researchers, am conducting a coronavirus survey. Yeah, so we're asking a bunch of questions regarding health-related behaviors like exercise, sleep, substance use, and its possible relation to coronavirus safe practices, as well as symptoms, and so on. Okay, to see the possible relationship among those variables. Not, again, not to explain a causative relationship or provide evidence of causative relationships, but at least to examine possible, to see what's out there, to describe what's going on. And the third would be the naturalistic observation. Yeah. And the naturalistic observation, as the term kind of suggests, is where someone just plants themselves somewhere to observe human behavior, to document it, to quantify it, or and so on, or describe it descriptively by qualitative means. Yeah, not attaching numbers to behaviors, but just describing maybe dynamics, interactional patterns, and so on. Okay. A very common one would be a school psychologist planting himself or herself in a grade school and watching how ADHD children are treated by the children who are not suffering from ADHD. The next group of studies, which are a massive part of research, yeah, may account for upwards of 50 or more percentage of the research in psychological research. Yeah, correlational studies. Now, a correlational study finds a degree of relationship between two or more variables. Yeah, so at the bare minimum, it may be like, say, dating and depression. Alrighty, usually it's more than just two variables, right? Like for example, coronavirus study, we got a whole bunch of variables, some of which I just described. And one of the things we may do is examine the correlations between certain health behaviors like smoking, vaping, amount of sleep with fears or anxieties or safety practices with the coronavirus. You can see how the two are correlated. Now, correlational studies seem to take a backseat to experimental studies, and there's some reasons for that, understandable reasons for that. But it really shouldn't take a backseat because correlational studies still provide us with valuable statistical data. Yeah. Now, the correlations might be a simple correlation like a Pearson correlation, finding the relationship between anxiety and depression. If anxiety goes up, right, scores tend to go up as well, right? Fairly consistent correlation that's been found in a whole bunch of studies, all righty? But it also allows for prediction, all righty? Not cause and effect, but if you know the mathematical, quantifiable relationship between two variables, let's just say studying behavior and smoking and grades, right? Those are three variables all on a continuum. You like study so many hours, you may smoke so much, your GPA can vary up and down. Yeah. By examining those variables, yeah, you can predict how much hours of study or smoking contributes to GPA performance, right? Down the road, 6 months later, a year later, depending on when the data was collected. Yeah, if the first two variables were collected at point one, and then GPAs were collected at the later point, a year later, and if you find a significant correlationship, right, that's huge, right? You can predict now the likelihood that if you spend a lot of hours studying, that it's going to still have an impact on your grades a year later. Okay. Now, another class example of how correlational studies can be powerful is the research Gottman had conducted several years ago examining couples. Yeah, I think he mostly examined heterosexual couples, and most were married, and he videotaped them arguing or having a disagreement over an issue, and he videotaped them. Now the next thing he did was he broke up those videotapes into small little segments, like barely a second segment, maybe 1 or 2 second segments. Yeah. And so in a, let's just say, for example, 15-minute conversation, right, he would break that up into just dozens and dozens and dozens of segments. Yeah. Each segment, right, being scored by his researchers, his graduate students, and they would score things such as eye contact, voice volume, words that were said, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, if the facial expression was sad or contemptuous, and so on. Yeah, and so scores were attached to all these behaviors. And what then they also collected was data. I think it was only a year later in terms of the frequency of people breaking up or divorcing. Yeah. And what they found, what Gottman found, was that he found a number of significant correlations between how they handled their disagreements, yeah, a year prior to whether they got separated or divorced a year later. Yeah. And kind of the interesting things that Gottman found was that if any of the partners, right, were seen with a facial expression of now, let me take a step back. Couples disagree. That's just the nature of being a couple, right? You have a disagreement, arguing. That's fine. Argument is healthy. Fighting isn't, right? Like fisticuffs, that's for damn sure it's not healthy. And even just fighting, calling names and stuff. But argument, right? Taking positions and presenting pros and cons and trying to you know uh, you know solve a problem, come to a resolution, right? Is healthy or can be healthy. Alrighty. And what he measured was that some couples could do it in a healthy way, right? In that they would listen to each other, listen to each other's sides, and that getting a little frustrated and showing that on the face wasn't the worst thing in the world. Alrighty. But there were certain behaviors that were correlated with later separation. Yeah. One of which, interesting enough, was if any of the not so much if they showed anger or frustration or sadness, but if they showed contempt, right? Which is a very unique emotional experience in that it's usually characterized, right, by looking down on the other, right? Thinking like they're stupid or they're lower than you or they're crazy or what have you. Not a good word to use. That they think poorly of the other person. If that facial expression showed and someone got scored for that, yeah, that was a predictor for later separation. Yeah. Another behavior which was really kind of fascinating that's found to be significantly correlated, if the males, particularly the males in these heterosexual couples, yeah, shut down, meaning just folded their arms and looked away and didn't say anything, and not female shutting down, male shutting down, seemed to be a predictor of later separation or divorce. So quite fascinating, really powerful stuff. And it's not to say that you can't say the shutting down or the face look of contempt, caused the separation. Yeah. Yeah, as correlations, you always, with correlational studies, it's not evidence of causative effects, right? We'll talk about how experiments do that. But correlational study nevertheless can tell you whether a variable at one point is related to another variable. It very well could be some third variable that's related to contempt and separation that actually explains is a causative factor. Okay, I think we kind of touched on this causation. It's the old mantra, the old maxim: causation, correlation is not causation. Okay, kind of touched on that. And even if you are mindful of that, it's really important to know how the correlation was found. Yeah, that's why you need to read the research. You need to read the article. Yeah, just because they say there's a correlation between dating and happiness, well, how did they collect the data? Okay. Now, for example, if it was a survey and they asked people first, how happy are you these days? Likert scale 1 to 7. How many dates did you have last month? Okay. Then they can fill out what number. Versus if they first asked, how many dates did you have last month? And then asked, how happy are you these days? What do you think is the difference, possible difference in terms of what scores you can get based just on the order you ask those two questions? Sure. On the second one, right? Um, if you make someone conscious of how many dates they had in the last month, just thinking about that might affect their response on the second question: how happy are you these days? Whereas in the former, if you do it in that sequence, right, just people are asked to report on their subjective happiness, and then they're asked about how many dates they had, right? So the latter situation, right, might actually pull for a stronger co-relationship between the two, because someone thinks back last month, oh, nothing. Gee, I've had no dates not only in the last month, but the last year. They start feeling a little less happy. And then when you ask how happy you are, instead of giving on a 1 to 7, a 7, they go, I don't know, 6, maybe 5, something like that. Whereas in the other one, if you just ask them how happy are you, go 7. And then you ask them how many dates, and they start reporting how many dates they had. Yeah. So even if there's a significant correlation, you need to find out how were the questions asked. Okay. And now in this example that regarding sequencing, ordering effects, as they're technically referred to, you'd certainly want to be sure that the survey alternates the order of these items. If they can, sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. At least, but if they didn't, right, the researchers would have to address that possibility. What is a quasi experiment? Okay. When anything is quasi, it's pseudo, right? It's not the real deal. It's kind of the fake experiment, so to speak. Alrighty. But when you hear of a quasi experimental design, what you're looking at is it's also referred to an ex post facto, meaning you're getting the data or the information after an event. Okay, so what's an example of a quasi-experimental design? Well, if you wanted to see the difference between, let's just say, Zoloft and Prozac in terms of its decreasing adolescent depression. All right, so you go to a clinic and you find 40 adolescents on Zoloft and 40 on Prozac, and you measure their level of depression. And what do you know? The Zoloft kids are a little less depressed. Does that mean that you found evidence that Zoloft causes a significant decrease in depression as opposed to Prozac? No, right? It may support it, but it is not evidence of a causative relationship. Why? Because you didn't have random assignment of subjects to either Zoloft or Prozac, right? Because there was no random assignment, right? They just were on it for whatever reasons they were prescribed it by their physicians. There are a number of alternate hypotheses or alternate explanations. Yeah, maybe the Zoloft adolescents, maybe it's more expensive, so they come from a higher SES, and just as an example, right? Or maybe they all go to Dr. A, who's really just also talks with them a lot, is very supportive, as opposed to Dr. B, who gives Prozac, isn't as supportive. And so there's always an alternate explanation. Yeah. And in the absence of random assignment, yeah, you cannot provide evidence. You're not providing evidence of a causative relationship. Okay. It may support a true experiment, or may suggest a genuine causative relationship, but it doesn't support. You can't, say that, oh, I found evidence that Zoloft causes a significant decrease in depressive symptoms as opposed to Prozac. Okay. Another form of longitudinal quasi-experimental design is longitudinal design. Okay. So that's where you look at a certain group and you measure them along some behavior, along some extended period of time. Yeah, and we're not talking, typically longitudinal designs tend to be anywhere as low as several months for up to years, sometimes decades. in some studies. Yeah. So one of the, like, for example, when I was an undergrad, one of my jobs just as a research assistant, I wasn't even a research assistant. I was an assistant to the research assistant. I did phone calls asking subjects who had been part of an IQ study at UH Manoa. And the by the time I was the assistant to the research assistant, the study had been going on for 20 years. Yeah, and subjects were being measured on the IQ every several years. Well, it was time for them to come in again for another IQ test. And I would phone them up, and I would say the vast majority of the time people would tell me to get lost. They weren't interested in participating anymore. And that's a real threat with longitudinal designs. It's really tough to keep subjects on board. That's why you often start off with like a few to several hundred, because you anticipate losing uh, maybe a few hundred along the way. But a longitudinal design of this sort would be to examine the possible effects of aging on IQ. Yeah. So that you could, while you're collecting the IQ data, you could also collect a biological, psychological variables, information, yeah, health behaviors, sleep, all that kind of stuff, and see how they're related with IQ performance across the lifespan. Yeah. So very common design. Well, no, I take that back. Not very common because it's very hard to conduct, right? Several hundred, few to 700 people over decades. So subjects don't drop off. Sometimes the researchers drop off. So it's very hard to conduct, very expensive. And they usually tend to be related to developmental issues. Yeah. Alrighty then. Here is the meat and potatoes of research, and there will be a number of experimental designs that you'll see referred to during the course of this semester, and that's the experimental design. All right. Now, what makes an experiment? And now, the thing is, the general public, right, lay people, not to sound elitist, but non-researchers use the term experiment kind of loosely. Right? They might refer to a quasi design as an experiment. Oh, in some lousy situations, when someone does a survey, someone might even call that an experiment. All righty. But really, what an experiment is, a true experiment, is when you have manipulation of the independent variable, like Prozac and Zoloft. But the key thing is when you have random assignment of subjects to receive Prozac or Zoloft. Okay. Now, why is that critical? Because if, let's just say, you get 80 depressed people, and you're going to give 80 depressed adolescents, and you're going to give 40 of them Zoloft and 40 of them Prozac. Okay. If you randomly, right, as say, okay, subject A, flip of a coin, heads, they get Zoloft, tails, they get Prozac, right? Do the same for subject 2, 3, 4, all the way through subject 80. Okay. If you do that flip of a coin, odds are about 40 will get Zoloft and about 40 will get Prozac. Okay. Now, what's the power of random assignment? When people receive different levels of the independent variable randomly, yeah, and if you start, and then you observe them on this treatment over a period of time, look for pre and then post measure changes. Any changes you see is evidence now of a causative relationship. Now, if the Zoloft people have significantly less depressed people at the post-test than the Prozac people, so you measure them pre, right, before they get the treatment, and it should be the same because you randomly assign them. It should be even Steven, right? They should have the same mean score on depression. They start receiving the treatment across 3 to 4 months, and then you do a post-test. And then if you measure them at that point, and then the Zoloft people are much less depressed than the Prozac people, then you can say you found evidence that Zoloft causes significant decreases in depressive symptoms in adolescents. Okay, you can argue away possible third variables. So it's now not Dr. A, Dr. B. It's not because Zoloft is more expensive, so you have to be from a higher SES to afford it or have better insurance. It's none of that, right? Because SES or the particular physician could be the causative effect. But if you randomly assign them, to either type of medication, right? So They might all go to still, you might even still use Dr. A and B, but Dr. A and B will still have people, some on Zoloft, some on Prozac, and Dr. B will have people on Zoloft and Prozac. Yeah, and the same thing with insurance or healthcare or other SES variables. They'll all wash out because they'll be balanced statistically by probability theory across the two conditions. Okay. Also, during an experiment, you can control for the other variables. So let's just say weight. You think weight has some relationship on adolescent depression. You can measure that, right? Before, during, and after. And then, because you can easily quantify weight, right? You see if there's any kind of relationship between weight and depression. Okay. So you can control for that, factor that out statistically, the effects of weight on the outcome. Yeah, because you counted it. All righty. So that's what's huge about an experiment. You know, so when you're reading articles that assert a causative relationship, make sure that they did random assignment. Okay, it's very unlikely that a true experiment will fail to mention that. They will always mention that. All righty. Once in every blue moon, someone who did an experiment, may have gotten past the reviewers, and something gets published where it didn't specify that it was random assignment. You had to infer there was random assignment, but that's rare. They'll usually clearly state that. Okay, other types of studies to be aware of. Oh, give me a second. The other type of studies, you've probably been hearing a lot of this in light of coronavirus, epidemiological studies, okay, which measure the rates of occurrence of a particular problem. So let's just say the rates of coronavirus. Alrighty, there's two types of studies you will hear of. Okay, and certainly with mental disorders, you hear of these two types of studies: incidence studies versus prevalence. Now, incidence studies refer to the number of new cases within a period. Yeah. So an incidence study, for example, when you hear on the news, they say 4,000 new deaths from coronavirus just today alone. That's an incidence study. Okay. If they say this week, right, the overall prevalence of coronavirus was 20,000. Yeah. So they're counting, in those cases, all the cases that, no, I'm sorry, not 20,000, but the prevalence at the end of the week was 380,000, right? So in that case, the prevalence, right, how coronavirus is prevailing or present includes the previous cases prior to the week, as well as the new cases that week. So prior and new for a grand total of 380,000 deaths, sadly, with coronavirus. Okay, so that's kind of the idea, the clear distinction between incidence and prevalence data. The other types of studies you see quite frequently, especially in abnormal psychology, are kinship studies. Yeah, because, and it's actually clinically very valuable to know a patient's family background in terms of particular disorders like schizophrenia, depression. Okay. Kinship studies tend to find the relationship. They refer to the individual and the likelihood of that of depression in the family, and the family is referred to as the proband. Yeah. So if let's say what is the prevalent the in a kinship study, a proband relationship might be, what is the likelihood of your parents suffering from bipolar disorder? Okay, if you have bipolar disorder, or siblings, or cousins. Yeah, so the proband may be parents, proband may be siblings, proband may be cousins. Alrighty, or the proband may be immediate versus extended family. So that's what the term proband is, designating a certain family relationship and the likelihood of the particular disorder or disease. Yeah. So, for example, people, if they have a cousin who's suffering from major depression, or a sibling, yeah, probably more like that, sibling suffering from bipolar disorder or major depression, they want to know what are the risks. Is that a moderate risk or low risk that they will also suffer from bipolar major depression. We'll skip that. Twin studies are very common in psychology, but and certainly in abnormal psychology. Typically, what's examined are the differences in the prevalence of problems between monozygotic versus dizygotic twins. Yeah, and if there's a higher correlation between two monozygotic versus two dizygotic twins, then it lends evidence that the disorder is more genetically based, yeah, or influenced. Okay, um, we find this for things such as emotional instability, personality traits, interest. That they through twin studies, we found that there is evidence to support a genetic contribution, okay, of um, of these particular characteristics. And it's certainly in other personality variables, with other personality variables too, like the big five. Yeah, we find similar things. Now, if two identical twins are more similar than two um, identical twins who are raised separately, right? The former who are raised together versus those who are raised separately, that suggests an environmental impact, right? So you got two pairs of not clones, but genetically identical individuals, but who are raised together or raised separately. And if those raised together are more similar in personality than those raised separately, that suggests an environmental impact. And of course, the other type of design, if you get those who are identical, who are raised separately, and you compare them to dizygotic twins who are as similar as any pair of siblings, yeah. And if the monozygotic twins raised separately are more similar than the dizygotic twins are raised separately, right? The same kind of environmental circumstance, it suggests it suggests a genetic contribution. Okay. And adoption studies do similarly, examining typically the correlation of in our case, abnormal psychology, a mental disorder or symptoms between biological and adoptive parents and with the child, to see if there are greater similarities between biological and parents and adoptees versus adoptive parents and adoptees. Okay, and research has shown that when it comes to personality traits, adoptees tend to be more likely to be similar to their biological parents than to their adoptive parents. Okay, but there are still many ways adoptive parents can have a bigger impact than biological parents. They can certainly have an impact on attitudes and values, religious faith, political inclinations, and so on. Yeah, so that can be the impact of adoptive parents and more so the environment. Okay, and with that, that's all I have to say about research designs. Yeah, and the initial question: what is abnormal behavior, and how to think? What criteria goes to how we think about what is abnormal or not abnormal? Okay, so we covered a lot of ground with that, folks, and with that, we'll continue with chapter two. And again, not again, but thank you for your time and attention, and I will see you again. Take care. Bye bye.